I will just go ahead and get started. This is so streamlined that, I even told Pamela, don't even waste your time with introductions. We'll just get into it because I know it's the end of the day and I get to play cleanup. So let me just start, first of all, by congratulating Pamela and her staff at MDIC for what I think has been a terrific public forum, really a tremendous job today. One thing I hear is that in spite of the fact that there are dozens of people at CDRH who are actively involved with MDIC and the work streams that are going on, I keep hearing of, is MDIC really important to the FDA? And I have to say, absolutely. And I wanted to use my time today to talk about how important MDIC is to the FDA, particularly to CDRH, and kind of work through a lot of things that may be going on at MDIC and the complementary work that's occurring at CDRH and how it's making a difference. And I'll kind of point to you that FDA and MDIC, we have a shared vision, we have shared objectives, and I believe we have a very strong shared future. And that's what I'd like to walk through. I'm going to have a lot of slides. I am not going to talk about everything on the slides. There is a resource. Anything I put in the public domain is available for everybody, so have at it if you will. I think for the big ticket priorities at the center, they're all driven by our 2012 vision that patients in the U.S. have access to high quality, safe and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world. And I will put to you that advancing regulatory science is absolutely essential to achieving that vision. Because if we're going to make that work, we have to have a good understanding of technologies. We know they're safe and effective, but to have timely patient access, we have to do that in an efficient manner. We essentially need the regulatory science, the tools, approaches, standards for assessing safety, effectiveness, quality, and performance. And we need them to generate robust evidence, to do so in a cost-effective manner, in a timely fashion, and be available when manufacturers need them. One of the biggest challenges is an issue comes up and we don't have the tool to deal with it. And that's why MDIC is ultimately so important. Now you heard we're sort of at 5 years into having MDIC, and I thought I would go back to find the slides that I was using back around 5 years ago. So I pulled some slides from a presentation we did, I think it was December 2012, when we signed the MOU with Life Science Alley to ultimately set up MDIC. This is straight out of it. This is what we were calling regulatory science. And what we discussed is why the big need here. And the data we had is that the U.S. government was spending a lot of money on basic science. They were spending a fair bit of money, but somewhat less on applied science. And overall, over time, pretty steady investment from the U.S. government, but also starting to see other countries were beginning to invest more money, and we might be losing our edge. But guess what? When we get to regulatory science, investments were not so good. So back in 2011, the NIH budget was about $30.9 billion. Most of that went for basic science, a little bit of applied science, and not a heck of a much for regulatory science. Here's what was happening at the FDA in medical devices. $15 million we put into it. That included the salaries for my scientists who spend half their time in just the bread and butter core programs, not even doing research. So not much money going into it. We talk about going from product development to marketing as being the valley of death. It never had to be the valley of death. Why? Because we invest as a country so much money in developing products, and we invest practically nothing in understanding what they do and getting them to market. You spend a fortune on heirloom seeds, and you did spend not a dime on an irrigation system. Guess what? You're not growing anything. That's sort of the problem. So we basically said, we're not going to solve this with Congress suddenly investing a lot more money. We can hope for it. Instead, we really had to think about collaboration between government, industry, and others, and that we needed a self-sustaining forum to do this kind of work, advancing regulatory science. Essentially, we needed a public-private partnership so we could share resources, dollars, data, and expertise. And then we announced the signing of the MOU with Life Science Alley. That was the partner we were going to dance with and set up MDIC. And that sort of brings us to now with MDIC's mission of a faster, safer, more cost-effective innovation for patient benefit is one we share with the partnership. It's also very relevant for least burdensome, a principle that was put by Congress into the law, but limited to just a handful of decisions in the pre-market space, expanded just a tad in 21st century cures. But we said this is fundamental, it's foundational to good government, this idea of the minimum amount of information necessary to adequately address a regulatory question or issue through the most efficient manner at the right time. So we put out guidance last year to essentially say that least burdensome is going to apply to all the regulatory decisions we make across the total product life cycle. And we've even followed it up with a strategic priority for 2018 through 2020 for CDRH of simplicity. Not being simplistic, but rather that in everything we do, we continually streamline our policies, processes, programs, and approaches as appropriate to more effectively, efficiently, and quickly achieve our mission and vision. And advancing regulatory science is one of the key underpinnings to this strategic priority. So what's been happening the past few years? This has been a road we have been traveling together, and I would say it has been well traveled together. To help in the work being done by MDIC, and so we can better leverage it. We also helped establish our medical device development tools program. We put out guidance to sort of explain a new framework for how we would go about in qualifying those tools, assuring that they are regulatory grade, that we can rely on them to make regulatory decisions. And we also then established a formal program, and since doing that from a year ago, we've already had 21 potential tools accepted into the program. 2 have already been approved, 5 are already in the qualification phase, and over the next few months, several more are going to enter into the qualification phase. So this is already moving forward, and the doors are open for business if you've got other things to send to us. So let's talk about some of the work streams. I'm not going to dwell on a lot of the details because we talked about them today. But for starters, the science of patient input. You know that we have put out a series of policies on the factors we use in making benefit risk determinations for a variety of decisions across the total product life cycle. And one of those factors was patient preferences. And we followed that up with then guidance to further flesh out that principle and the considerations if you're going to do patient preference information, PPI studies, and now are using that to inform and supporting pre-market approval decisions. And MDIC, complementary to that, put out a framework on it as well as a compendium of methodologies for conducting PPI studies. And since then, we've now been taking that and we are working with companies and trying to encourage them to conduct these studies. And as of today, we have 14 industry-sponsored studies that have either been completed or underway, and we're anticipating more in the works in the near term. It's already helped inform decisions on bringing new technologies to market and expanding labeling indications for technologies already on the market, and we're going to see that occur more and more in the future because of the work being done at MDIC and with our participation. And in the future, just laying out a number of the different things we're going to do, but one of the big areas we're focused on is patient-generated data. And so you've heard, too, that NEST Coordinating Center is putting out an RFP on patient-generated data. So now we're going to start seeing more and more of the science of patient input work stream and the NEST work stream link up together. And to let you know, this is new information. For our very second meeting of the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee, which is going to occur, mark it on your calendars, on November 15th. The topic we're going to be talking about is potential uses for patient-generated data in medical device regulatory functions. We'll talk about wearable trackers, patient-driven registries, social media platforms. So again, very important is the work that MDIC is doing, and we are engaged in complementary work as well, driving decisions at the center. Clinical diagnostics. A lot of different work streams underway. Already the framework for surrogate samples has been put out the door. And now some of the other work like somatic reference samples can be very important for our efforts on next generation sequencing tests. The use of these samples and ultimately reference standards, incredibly important for streamlining, in some cases maybe even obviating steps in the regulatory process for diagnostic companies. Along with this, we have put out policy around considerations for analytical validation, and that includes the ability to leverage reference samples. We have also put out policy on being able to recognize clinical databases in support of demonstrating clinical validity, and some of the other work stream under MDIC is going to be highly relevant to these undertakings. We've also put out modified regulatory framework now on oncopanel genetic tests too. All of these linked together. And I think, as you know, there's legislation that has been introduced to establish a framework for what's being called in vitro clinical tests, tests that may be made by not just traditional IVD manufacturers, but also laboratories. And should such legislation come to pass, I think the work of MDIC in this space will become increasingly more important, has the opportunity to become more impactful, and bringing in a larger array of participants into this work. Cybersecurity. Again, lots of work we've done in this space in the pre-market and post-market across the total product life cycle, laying out considerations of our expectations for companies and recommendations for assuring the cybersecurity of technologies. In April of this year, we put out our Medical Device Safety Action Plan. It discussed a variety of the steps we have taken already or have underway or exploring for advancing device safety, ensuring we have safer, more effective technologies on the market. One of the points we made is that safety and innovation are not diametrically opposed activities. In fact, we see them very tightly linked up. If we have advances in innovation, if we have advances in regulatory science to drive innovations for safer, more effective technologies, that is a patient safety issue. If we are able to drive innovation for technologies that meet unmet medical needs, that's a patient safety issue because we are preventing or mitigating harm from the disease that's impacting that patient. So they're very much aligned. One of the areas in this plan we talk about is cybersecurity. And we are exploring additional authorities in the pre-market and the post-market space. One of those is around coordinated vulnerability disclosures. A critically important area that was talked about today, and regardless of whether we get new authorities, the work being done by MDIC now to understand the barriers for adoption and developing a playbook for coordinated vulnerability disclosures is directly aligned and highly important for this critical area in cybersecurity. Clinical trials. Again, lots of policies that we have put out, changing our paradigms and our approaches on clinical trials. We've also made a lot of process improvements, and as a result, the median time to a full approval on an IDE has dramatically dropped in the past few years. It's held rock steady at 30 days. We've also a lot of effort on early feasibility studies, as you heard. If we can bring those back to the U.S., we can start bringing innovation back to the U.S. And already as a result of changes in policy and process, about a 50% increase in the number of early feasibility studies we're seeing in the U.S. And we are now approving about 75% of early feasibilities, full approval or approval with conditions on the first cycle. Big difference from a few years ago. And of course, we're seeing early feasibility studies now in more disease areas than we had previously. And of course, we've done work too with CMS to modify the criteria being used in making Category A and Category B decisions. As a result, there are more kinds of clinical studies, including some early feasibility studies, that can be eligible for Category B designation. Also, as a greater incentive for conducting studies, including early feasibility studies in the US. And now we have the MDIC effort. So we've been focused on the regulatory side. The MDIC effort now dealing with a lot of non-regulatory issues around contracting, IRB approval, and more rapid enrollment of patients into early feasibility studies. We see these two pieces coming together to truly drive the innovation engine here in the US. Computational modeling and simulation. One of the areas has been around, quote unquote, virtual patients, leveraging prior clinical data that then could be borrowed where appropriate to reduce the size of a subsequent clinical trial. One of the steps being done with MDIC was to develop a mock submission for a hypothetical ICD lead. And that was incredibly informative because that mock submission we were able to review in-house and working with industry. It was a great learning experience for all of us on sort of a path forward for doing it. Now, this was limited to data from a single clinical trial, so then the next effort is on the use of external data writ more broadly. So thinking about what's the kind of information we can use. Can we talk about multiple traditional clinical trials, or now data from real-world data sources, or linking the two together, and then identifying what are the various methodologies that can be used for virtual patients. And the next stage is also doing this now for bench testing with a generic IVC filter. And then on top of it is developing a platform, sort of the submission of the future. How do we start bringing together computer simulated data coming in, more traditional clinical trial and bench testing, into an entirely different kind of review experience? Health economics and patient access. We had established our parallel review program with CMS, the opportunity to engage with us in CMS to get input on the clinical data needed to bring that product to market and to get CMS coverage decision-making. Since setting up that program, we've now had 75 inquiries, 34 applications. 2 devices have already made it through with significant time savings. And the real value here is, and we think so important to our vision, is if you want to have real access to a technology, particularly expensive one, you need to have adequate coverage and reimbursement. And so we've expanded this opportunity for, as a voluntary basis, for private payers too. And you heard today that now Care First and United Health Group have joined in, have signed up for this program. And we've already had 10 interactions under this program with private payers and with companies. NEST, we don't have to go into NEST. Lots of discussion around it, something we had proposed back in 2012. But we've also been working on our own on setting up some of the infrastructure, particularly around coordinated registry networks, both national and international. We have been leveraging real-world evidence in our decision-making. Since 2015, we've identified over 50 examples in support of post-market and pre-market decisions, including new products coming to market. Under the Medical Device Safety Action Plan I mentioned, one of the things that we have put on the table is working with the NEST Coordinating Center on creating capabilities for active surveillance, something we had always proposed for NEST. And the President's budget includes a proposal for funding to do just that. That has been supported by the House. We haven't seen it in the Senate. But we remain hopeful. We'll see what Congress does, and maybe we'll get the dollars to make this happen. And then kind of looking forward, I mentioned, the device benefit risk frameworks, that patient preferences was one factor. Another factor, of course, is uncertainty. And just like we did with patient preferences, put out guidance to further expand upon it. You heard today we just issued today draft guidance on expanding on that factor of uncertainty now in benefit risk determinations in support of product approvals to make it more robust and consistent. And one of the things we talk about is what we focus on is not statistical significance. It isn't about a p-value. It's about clinical significance. And there will always be uncertainty around benefits and risks. Congress recognized that when they set the standard of reasonable assurance, safety and effectiveness, not absolute assurance. But if we're going to do this in a robust manner, we need to flesh out that concept, and we're doing that for the very first time. Here are the implications. This can help drive certain technologies coming to market, and particularly in certain spaces. And one of the big ones is PMAs for small patient populations. If you're dealing with a patient population of over 8,000 a year, you are out of luck for a humanitarian device exemption pathway. And as a result, we have not seen a lot of innovation in the space of when we deal with small patient populations, our version of rare disorders. We need to be thinking about what is the appropriate level of uncertainty to accept in those circumstances. And we talk about that in this guidance. And we think this is one opportunity to drive greater innovation in this space. And that is particularly for pediatric patients, one of the areas. But to make that successful, then we need to have the post-market data collection infrastructure to address some of that remaining uncertainty. And we need to have a good post-market safety net, such as with active surveillance capabilities. NEST is essential for making this happen. And the next step here that we are already working on in the International Medical Device Regulators Forum is to establish a medical device single review program, where the decision for marketing authorization made by one participating country would be relied on in whole or in part by the other participating countries. And so we are taking steps through this uncertainty guidance and through others on making changes to start bringing us in alignment with some of the other countries in a responsible manner. And through IMDRF, we're putting the building blocks in place then to have such a review program. And that's our goal, to do so in the next few years. Case for quality, you've heard about two, value coming out of there. If all goes well, plans are, let's see if we can launch a formal quality appraisal program in 2019. There is also dollars in the President's budget to support such an effort. And then last two things I want to leave you with. I talked about collaboration is absolutely critical in the work that we do, and that's been fundamental in MDIC. But we're taking this to the next level. And this is one of our strategic priorities in 2018 through 2020. We call it collaborative communities. We all know the importance of collaboration. But what's a collaborative community? Because typically collaboration is one-offs. We get together, we deal with a project, we have a few deliverables, and we're done. Collaborative community is a continuing forum where we have public and private sector members are proactively working together to achieve common objectives and outcomes, solving shared challenges, and we're leveraging collective opportunities in an environment of trust, respect, and openness. Key points: we don't lead it. FDA isn't in charge. This is not command and control. Instead, we are part of that community. That community should be including a diverse range of stakeholders who are affected and interested in it. And it means for FDA that we have to be willing to accept what the community wants to do to achieve that outcome, even if it might not be our first choice, with the backstop that it can't run afoul of our statutory mandates or ultimately not be in the best interests of public health and patients. This is a fundamentally different way for us to behave. Why so important? Here for MDIC, there are a number of different deliverables that can come out of it, many of the things that MDIC already engaged in doing. But also, we committed to establish at least 10 new such communities by the end of calendar year 2020. And we think, for starters, two efforts already underway in MDIC are ripe to become collaborative communities. For starters, NEST. We've always envisioned NEST as the place to bring the ecosystem together around real-world evidence. That's why the governing committee was intentionally designed to have representation from all those stakeholder communities. It is now building that out to not just have representatives, but to truly engage each of those communities. The second is case for quality. is another place ripe to become a collaborative community. And we would love to explore other opportunities with MDIC to do this, as with the rest of the ecosystem. And then finally, some changes occurring in CDRH to assure that we are built for the future today. We have long tried to apply a total product lifecycle approach to the work that we do. Unfortunately, we are not organizationally structured to do that as effectively as we can. We need an infrastructure that's able to adapt far more quickly to our future organizational, regulatory, and scientific needs. And our goals here are, we're flattening the organization, moving to a team model approach where the team handles issues throughout the total product lifecycle, as opposed to separate offices for pre-market review, post-market surveillance, and compliance. Better opportunities then for our experts to share their expertise and their knowledge. And this is something we also have under our Medical Device Safety Action Plan. And this is the structure in the new office we've called the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality. We have been working on this for 3 years. If you are dealing with the center right now, you will know we are in the midst of a pilot. We have our organizations, the Offices of Device Evaluation, of in vitro diagnostics, radiological health, compliance, and surveillance and biometrics, are already working under a pilot as close as we can to this structure in the absence of a formal reorganization. It's our hope we will get that blessed in the very near future and make that official. But this will put us in a far better position for doing the work we are engaged with MDIC. For example, we're bringing together a clinical trials program, epidemiologists, statisticians, and medicine. So we move away from separating out traditional clinical trials and real-world evidence. We'll have a focus on clinical evidence, regardless of the source, all through one office. And that's going to be our main entry point in our work on NEST. Finally, along those lines with changes, one change we have announced is I used to have a Deputy Center Director for Science. That was Bill Maisel. Bill last September moved off of that position into being the Director for ODE. And if this structure is blessed, he is now sort of acting in the pilot role for overseeing those offices. He would become the new head for OPEC. He is the right person for that position. The Deputy Center Director for Science position is changing, though. When Bill came in 2010, we were very focused internally. We're a different center today, so we are recruiting, and this is why I'm telling everyone, we are in the midst of recruiting to fill that position. This will be a very outward-looking position with a main focus of driving medical device innovation. And as I mentioned, innovation is so critical for safety as well. And the big focus is our engagement with external partners on driving innovation. So that is payers. That includes the work of MDIC is under that portfolio, our external work on patient engagement and digital health. So we are looking for a more senior level person, preferably with good industry experience, because they've got to understand the ecosystem and what drives towards innovation. So if you know of the right person, let us know, because we're actively recruiting. This will be a critical position for the work of MDIC and for innovation writ large at CDRH. And with that, I will say thank you.